Harold Whitmore slammed his fist on the kitchen table so hard the oil lamp jumped and nearly tipped sideways. "Done," he said. "It's settled." Clara stood in the doorway, still holding the dish towel she'd been using when she heard the men's voices. Two of them. One she recognized, one she didn't. She was 18 years old, and she had learned early that when her uncle used that particular word, done, there was no arguing, no asking questions, no crying that would change a single thing. The stranger sitting across from Harold was broad-shouldered and weather-worn, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that had spent too many winters outdoors and not enough time sleeping. He wasn't looking at Harold anymore. He was looking at her. Harold turned around. When he saw her standing there, something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite. Something closer to the expression a man gets when he's done a thing he knew was wrong before he did it. "This is Cole Brennan," Harold said. "He's a rancher, out of Wyoming territory." Clara looked at the stranger, then back at her uncle. "He's taking you with him," Harold said. "Week from now. It's already arranged." If you've ever felt like the ground opened up beneath your feet without any warning, like one ordinary moment cracked apart and swallowed everything you thought was real, then you already know what Clara Whitmore felt standing in that doorway with a damp dish towel in her hands. What would you do if the only family you had left sold you to a stranger? This story will tear your heart out before it puts it back together, and I promise you, you won't want to look away. If you're new here, please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, because what happens next in this family's journey will shake you to the bone. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that kitchen, because what happened next, what Harold Whitmore said when Clara finally found her voice and asked him why, that is where this story truly begins. Clara didn't move from the doorway for what felt like a full minute. Her eyes stayed on her uncle's face, waiting for something. A flicker of regret, a sign that this was some kind of terrible joke, the kind of grim humor Harold occasionally produced when he'd had too much to drink. But Harold wasn't looking at her anymore. He'd already turned back toward the table, already reaching for the glass of whiskey sitting near his elbow. "Uncle Harold." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Don't start," he said. "I haven't started anything. I'm asking you a question." Harold set down his glass. "Brennan here lost his wife 8 months ago. He's got 3 children and a ranch that's falling apart. He needs help. You need a place." He said it like he was reading from a ledger, like she was an entry in a column. "It works out for everyone." Clara looked at Cole Brennan. He hadn't said a word since she walked in. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not cruel, not warm, just steady. The way a man looks at a problem he's still deciding how to approach. "You paid him," Clara said. Not to her uncle, to the stranger. Cole Brennan didn't flinch. "I did." "How much?" Silence stretched across the room. Harold made a sound in his throat, something between a cough and a warning. $40, Cole said, "and 2 head of cattle." $40, 2 head of cattle. Clara stood very still and let that land. She had grown up in this house. She had cooked Harold's meals and washed his shirts and kept his accounts when his hands shook too badly from drink to hold a pen. She had buried her mother from this house 5 years ago, and her father 2 years before that. She had stayed because there was nowhere else to go, and because Harold was blood, and because she had believed, foolishly, she now understood, that blood meant something. $40, 2 head of cattle. "I want you to think very carefully," she said quietly, "about what you just told me." Harold's jaw tightened. "Clara, you sold me." "I arranged a position. You sold me," she said again, "like livestock." The word livestock sat in the air between them. Cole Brennan's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Some small muscle near his jaw moved and then went still again. Harold pushed back from the table. "You've got no money, no prospects, and no way to survive a winter in this county on your own. Brennan offers a roof, food, and work. That's more than most girls your age have got." "I'm not most girls." "No," Harold said, and something ugly edged into his voice. "You're a girl who forgets she's been living on my charity for 3 years. Clara's hands curled around the dish towel. She forced herself to breathe. She wanted to say a great many things in that moment. She had always been better at thinking than speaking, better at watching than reacting, and right now she was watching Harold Whitmore very clearly, watching the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, the way his hand had gone back to his whiskey glass, though he hadn't lifted it. He knew what he'd done. He just needed her to accept it quietly so he didn't have to feel it. She turned to Cole Brennan. "Do you understand what kind of man you've done business with?" she asked. Cole looked at her for a long moment. "I'm starting to," he said. She wasn't sure what that meant. She wasn't sure about anything at all except that she was going to Wyoming in a week's time, whether she chose to or not, and that choosing to, even when the choice had been stolen from her, was the only power she had left. "I'll need my mother's trunk," she said to Harold, "and her quilt. And I'll need $10 from whatever he paid you, because I have earned that much and more in the 3 years I've kept your household alive." Harold looked like he wanted to argue. He looked at Cole Brennan instead. Something passed between the two men, some calculation, and then Harold reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded bill and set it on the table without a word. Clara picked it up. She folded it once and put it in her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was perfectly level. "Supper will be ready in an hour, Mr. Brennan, if you're staying." She walked back into the kitchen. She stood over the pot on the stove for a moment, her hands braced against the iron edge, and let herself shake, just for a moment, just once, before she picked up the spoon and started stirring again. Cole Brennan stayed for supper. He ate quietly, answered Harold's questions about his ranch in short, practical sentences, and watched Clara move through the kitchen with an expression she couldn't read and didn't try to. She learned the basic facts of him over the course of that meal, the way you learn the shape of unfamiliar terrain, by the shadows it casts rather than by seeing it directly. His ranch was 3 days' ride northwest of Laramie. He had 3 children, Ethan, who was 11, Molly, who was 8, and Lily, who had just turned 5. His wife, Margaret, had died of a fever the previous winter. He had a foreman named Bill and 2 ranch hands, neither of whom, he made clear, were suited to the work of keeping a household running or children fed and clothed. He didn't say what he expected from Clara specifically. He used words like help and manage the household and see to the children, and each time Harold tried to interject something about Clara's domestic skills, as though he were advertising an asset, Cole cut him off with a single short syllable and moved on. After supper, Cole thanked Harold, put on his coat, and paused at the door. "I'll be back Friday morning," he said. "We leave at first light." He looked at Clara once, briefly. "I'm sorry about the circumstances," he said. It didn't sound like an apology exactly. It sounded like a man stating a fact he'd already made peace with. Clara met his eyes. "So am I," she said. He nodded and went out into the dark. Wasem. The week passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Harold didn't speak much. Clara packed her mother's trunk, sorted through the few things that were hers by right, and tried to prepare herself for a life she could not yet picture. On Thursday evening, she walked out to the small plot of ground behind the house where her parents were buried. The markers were simple, 2 wooden crosses, weathered soft by years of Missouri winters. She crouched down and touched her mother's cross and stayed there for a while without speaking, because there wasn't anything to say that her mother didn't already know. She was going to be all right. She had decided this the night Cole Brennan arrived, standing in the kitchen with her hands shaking over the stove, and she had not unmade the decision since. Whatever Wyoming was, whatever this ranch, and this man, and these children turned out to be, she was going to meet it with her eyes open. She had survived this house. She had survived Harold and his silences and his drinking and the particular cruelty of someone who doesn't hate you but simply doesn't value you. She could survive a frontier. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing yet, was that surviving was only the beginning of what would be asked of her. Cole arrived Friday before dawn, as promised. He had a wagon, 2 horses, and almost nothing to say. Clara loaded her trunk herself, refused Harold's half-hearted offer of help, and climbed up onto the wagon seat without looking back at the house. Harold stood on the porch. He raised one hand in something that might have been a farewell gesture. Clara looked forward. Cole clicked the horses into motion, and they moved out onto the frozen road, and the house behind her disappeared into the gray morning light. For the first several hours they rode in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, exactly. More like 2 people taking each other's measure from a careful distance. The road wound through flat country first, then slowly began to rise. And by midday the sky had turned the particular shade of white-gray that Clara had learned to associate with incoming weather. "How bad do winters get?" she asked, the first thing she'd said since they left. Cole glanced at her sideways. "Bad. How bad is bad?" "Some years you lose cattle to the cold. Some years you lose more than that." A pause. "Last winter was the worst I'd seen in 12 years. He said it flatly, but she heard what was underneath it. Last winter was when Margaret had died. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife." He didn't answer right away. "Thank you," he said finally, and moved on. They stopped at a way station the first night, a low-built structure that served as both tavern and traveler's rest. Cole paid for separate rooms without being asked. Clara noted this and said nothing. She lay in the narrow bunk and listened to the wind pressing against the walls and thought about Ethan, 11 years old and already fatherless in the way that children who've lost one parent to grief sometimes are. She thought about Molly at 8, about Lily at 5, who may or may not remember her mother clearly by now. She thought about arriving, about walking through the door of a house that had belonged to another woman, where 3 children would look at her and know exactly what she was and was not. She didn't sleep much. On the second day, the country changed. The flat Missouri-adjacent land gave way to something bigger, more severe. The mountains appeared on the horizon in the middle of the afternoon, white-capped and enormous, so large they seemed to belong to a different scale than everything Clara had grown up knowing. She had seen pictures. Pictures had not prepared her. "How far?" she asked. "Tomorrow afternoon," Cole said. She kept her eyes on the mountains. That evening, camped beside a creek that was frozen along both edges but still running dark water through the center, Cole made coffee and handed her a tin cup without being asked. They sat across from each other by the fire, and for the first time he seemed to look at her directly, rather than sideways. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "All right. I'm not—" What Harold implied. He stopped, reformulated. "I'm not looking for a wife. I had a wife. What I need is someone to help me keep 3 children from falling apart." He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "I thought you should know that before we get there." Clara looked at the fire. "I appreciate the honesty. Can you cook?" "Yes." "So? Preserve food, handle a sick child?" "Yes to all of it." "Good." He stared into his coffee. "Ethan is going to be the hardest. The girls will follow his lead, and right now his lead is to distrust anyone who isn't me or Bill." "How long has he been that way?" "Since his mother died." Cole turned his cup slowly in his hands. He was there when she passed, 11 years old, and he sat with her the whole last night. He didn't sleep, didn't eat. When it was over, he walked out to the barn and stayed there until I came to get him. Clara absorbed this. "What did he say to you?" "Nothing. Hasn't said much since." Cole met her eyes briefly. "I need you to not take that personally. He's not a mean boy. He's just broken in a specific way, and I haven't been able to fix it." "You shouldn't have to fix it alone," Clara said. Something moved through Cole Brennan's expression. Something quick and unguarded, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. He looked back at the fire. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." It was, in fact, a very long day. They reached the Brennan Ranch late in the afternoon, with the sun already low and the temperature dropping fast. Clara's first impression was of scale. The land stretched in every direction farther than she could comfortably look, and the mountains behind the property were no longer horizon line abstractions, but enormous, real, immediate things. The ranch buildings themselves were solid but wearing, a main house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, and several smaller structures she couldn't identify from a distance. Bill, the foreman, came out to meet them. He was somewhere in his 50s, a lean, sun-dried man who took the horses' bridles without being asked, and nodded at Clara with a frankness that struck her as more respectful than most of the looks she'd gotten in the past week. "Children are inside," he told Cole. "Lily's been asking every hour since noon." Cole stepped down from the wagon. He reached back and offered Clara his hand. Not warmly, not coldly, just practically. And she took it and stepped down. The front door opened. A small figure appeared in the doorway. Lily Brennan was 5 years old, with her father's dark hair and enormous eyes, and she was looking at Clara with an expression of total, unguarded terror. Clara had been braced for hostility, for suspicion, for the closed-off protective wariness that grieving children showed towards strangers, particularly strangers who arrived in a parental role. She had not been braced for terror, for a 5-year-old who looked at her as though she were something to be frightened of. Clara stopped where she was. She didn't move forward. She let Lily look at her. "Hi, sweetheart," Cole said, stepping past Clara toward the door. He crouched down to the child's level. "I'm home." Lily's eyes stayed on Clara. "That's Miss Clara," Cole said. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, to help out." Lily didn't speak. She pressed herself against the doorframe and kept staring. From somewhere behind her in the house came the sound of footsteps, heavier, deliberate, and then Ethan appeared. He was tall for 11, dark-eyed like his father and his sister, and he had Cole's same quality of looking at a thing directly without blinking. He assessed Clara from the doorway for 3 full seconds. "She's the one you bought," he said. Cole straightened up. "Ethan, Bill told me." Ethan's voice was flat. Not cruel, just factual, the way children state difficult truths when they've decided there's no point in being indirect. "He paid money for you." Clara looked at the boy steadily. She had prepared 6 responses for this moment over the past 3 days of travel, and now that she was in it, she discarded all of them. "He did," she said. Ethan blinked. Apparently he had expected a denial or reassurance or some adult attempt to soften the truth into something easier to swallow. "That makes you feel like I don't have a choice about being here," Clara said. "I understand that." Ethan's jaw was very tight. "My mother's room is her room," he said. "Nobody sleeps in there." "I won't," Clara said. "I'll sleep wherever your father puts me. That isn't that room." A pause. Ethan looked at his father. "The room off the kitchen," Cole said quietly. "Nobody's used it." Ethan gave a single, stiff nod. Then he turned and went back inside, and Lily, after one more long look at Clara, followed her brother. Clara stood on the frozen ground in front of the Brennan house and let out a slow, careful breath. The mountains were very large behind her. The wind off them was the coldest she had ever felt. Her trunk was still in the wagon, and she had nothing but $10 and whatever capability she could produce, and 3 children inside that house who ranged from frightened to hostile to outright contemptuous, and a man who had made it explicitly clear that he was not looking for anything more from her than function. "This," she told herself, "is what you have. Now figure out what to do with it." The room off the kitchen was small and plain, a narrow bed, a window that faced the back of the property, and a wooden hook on the wall for hanging clothes. Someone had put a blanket on the bed that wasn't quite thick enough for the cold, and Clara spent her first hour adding her mother's quilt on top of it and arranging the few things from her trunk that made the room feel less like a waiting cell. From the kitchen, she could hear the sounds of Molly, the middle child 8 years old who she hadn't properly met yet, moving around. Footsteps, the clink of something ceramic, low murmuring to herself or to Lily, who appeared to trail after her sister like a small, anxious shadow. Cole was outside. Clara could hear him and Bill talking near the barn, their voices a low, indistinct murmur under the wind. She came out of her room into the kitchen and found Molly standing at the stove, attempting to stir something in a pot that was clearly too heavy for her. The child had her back to the door and didn't hear Clara come in. Clara watched for a moment. The stove was too hot. The damper was open too wide, and the bottom of whatever was in the pot was already beginning to catch. Molly was stirring furiously, her arms working hard against the weight of the cast-iron pot, her shoulder blades tense under her dress. "May I help?" Clara said. Molly spun around. The spoon hit the edge of the pot and clattered sideways. Molly grabbed for it and missed, and the spoon went on the floor. Both of them looked at it. Molly's face had gone carefully blank, the face children wear when they're deciding whether to be afraid or angry and haven't settled on one yet. Clara crossed the kitchen, picked up the spoon, and went to the basin to rinse it. Then she went to the stove and adjusted the damper. The sound of the fire inside changed immediately. Lower, steadier. "What's in the pot?" Clara asked. Molly said nothing. "I'm not criticizing. I'm asking because it smells like it might be bean soup, and I'd like to know what you've already put in so I don't add something twice." A pause. "It's not soup," Molly said stiffly. "It's porridge." Clara looked into the pot. The bottom was definitely scorching. She moved it half off the heat and stirred carefully from the edges in. "Your damper was open too wide," she said. "This stove runs hot." Silence. "You've been cooking for how long?" Clara asked. Molly's jaw set. "Since November." "Since November." That was roughly 2 months after Margaret died, an 8-year-old keeping a household fed. Clara kept her voice level. "You've done well then." Molly stared at her with open suspicion, as though she'd been offered something that probably had a catch. "I'm not being kind," Clara said. "I mean it practically. You haven't burned the house down and your family is alive and fed. That's not nothing, at your age." Something shifted in Molly's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a slight reduction in the defensive tension around her eyes. "Papa said you're going to cook now," Molly said. "I'm going to help," Clara said. "This is your kitchen." Molly seemed uncertain what to do with that. She looked at the pot. "It always sticks on this stove," she said finally. "I've tried everything." "Cast iron that size needs lower heat and more time," Clara said. "And you need to stir from the very bottom. Here." She handed the spoon back to Molly and moved aside. "Like this." Deep strokes, all the way down. Molly took the spoon and tried it. The resistance from the bottom of the pot was obvious on her face. "There," Clara said. "Keep doing that and it won't stick." Molly stirred. The sound changed, smoother, less catching. From the doorway, a small voice said, "Is it ready?" Clara turned. Lily had appeared in the kitchen entrance, round-eyed and cautious, her arms around herself against the cold. "Not yet," Molly said. Then, after a pause, "Come in if you're cold. Close the door." Lily came in. She stationed herself on the far side of the kitchen from Clara, pressed against the wall near the window, and watched. Clara didn't try to speak to her. She found a second pot, checked what provisions were available, and started quietly making the kind of simple additions to the porridge that would make it more substantial. A little salt, some dried apples she found in a covered crock, a piece of hard cheese she grated and let melt in. By the time Cole and Ethan came in from the cold, there was a meal on the table that was better than what would have been there otherwise, and Clara had not once told any of the children what to do or tried to rearrange the kitchen or comment on how things had been done before she arrived. She sat at the far end of the table and ate and didn't speak unless spoken to. Ethan didn't speak to her. Lily watched her over the rim of her bowl with those enormous, careful eyes. Molly, just once, glanced at her sideways and then quickly looked away. Cole across the table said, "The porridge is better than usual." He wasn't looking at Clara when he said it. He was looking at Molly. Molly looked at her bowl. "Miss Clara showed me something about the stove," she said, very quietly, very carefully neutral. Cole nodded once and said nothing more. Clara stared at her own supper and let the sound of wind pressing against the windows fill the silence between them all. That night, alone in the small room off the kitchen, she took out her mother's quilt and held it in her lap for a while in the dark. The ranch made sounds at night that her uncle's house had never made. The deep groan of timber in the cold, the particular howl that wind develops in open country, the distant sounds of animals in the barn. The mountains outside her window were invisible in the dark, but she could feel them, the way you can feel a large thing standing near you even when you can't see it. She wasn't frightened precisely. She was something more complex than frightened. She had arrived at a house where a dead woman's presence was still in every room. In the room no one was allowed to enter, in the 11-year-old boy who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since November, in the 8-year-old girl who had been keeping a family fed on 2 small shoulders. The woman she was not replacing, never replacing, and she understood the difference mattered enormously, had been loved in this house. You could feel it, the shape of her absence, the way you can feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Clara did not want to be Margaret. She had no intention of pretending to be anyone other than who she was. A girl from Missouri with $10 and a dead mother's quilt and a stubborn, possibly foolish belief that she could make something out of whatever circumstances she'd been handed. She just needed the children to let her try. She just needed Cole Brennan to stay out of her way long enough for her to figure out what, exactly, this family needed. And she needed to do all of it in a house where it was made perfectly clear, with every silence and every averted glance and every closed door, that she had been bought here, that her presence was a transaction and nothing more. Outside, the Wyoming wind pressed hard against the walls of the Brennan ranch house, and the mountains stood unseen in the dark. And inside her small room, Clara Whitmore sat with her mother's quilt in her hands and decided quietly and absolutely that she was not going to let this place break her. Not this place. Not these children. Not this man. Not even the cold. The first week on the Brennan Ranch taught Clara three things. The stove ran hot on the left side and cold on the right, which meant anything you wanted to cook evenly had to be shifted halfway through. The water pump in the yard froze solid before 5 in the morning and needed to be coaxed with warm water carried from the kitchen before it would cooperate. And Ethan Brennan, 11 years old and built like a boy who had decided he was done being a boy, did not sleep past 4:30. She knew this last thing because she didn't sleep past 4 herself. Old habit from Harold's house, where the earliest riser controlled the day. On her third morning at the ranch, she came into the kitchen at 20 past 4 and found Ethan already there, sitting at the table with his coat on and a cup of cold water in front of him, staring at nothing. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke. She went to the stove, built the fire up, put water on, and said nothing at all. Ethan sat at the table and watched her work with the particular watchfulness of a boy who had gotten used to cataloging threats. After a while, the kitchen grew warmer. Clara found oats and set them to soak. She found the coffee and measured it out. "There's a trick to the pump," Ethan said, without preamble. "You have to push the handle down twice before you pull up. If you just pull up, it locks." Clara absorbed this. "Thank you," she said. Ethan wrapped both hands around his water cup. "Molly didn't know that. She broke 2 pitchers trying to force it." He paused. "Don't tell her I told you." "I won't," Clara said. Silence again. But it was a slightly different silence than before. She did not make the mistake of trying to be liked. She understood, in the practical way that people who've had to read rooms since childhood understand things, that likability was the wrong currency in this house. What these children needed from her was not warmth. They had been burned by warmth and lost together, and the combination had made them careful. What they needed was reliability. The same thing in the same place at the same time, day after day, until the part of them that kept bracing for the next catastrophe could begin, slowly, to unclench. So she cooked breakfast at the same time every morning. She had the kitchen cleaned and orderly before Cole came in for coffee. She kept the fire at a consistent temperature, and she didn't ask the children for anything they weren't ready to give, and she didn't take up more space in the house than she needed to. It cost her something, this careful smallness. She was not by nature a small person. She had opinions about how things ought to be done, and they were usually correct, and she'd had to learn early, in Harold's house, to keep most of them behind her teeth. She was drawing on that same skill now, and it was working, but it left her tired in a way that sleep didn't quite fix. Cole noticed. She could tell by the way he watched her sometimes, not with concern exactly, more like the assessment of a man who is keeping track of whether his arrangement is functioning as intended. He was not unkind to her. He was also not much present. He rose before she did most mornings, and came in after dark most evenings, and the hours in between he spent on the land, working it with the focused single-mindedness of a man who had decided that motion was the closest thing to survival. Bill told her, without being asked, that Cole had barely slept the winter Margaret was sick, that he'd kept the ranch running on nothing, riding out in weather that should have kept any sensible person indoors, because movement was the one thing that kept the worst of it from landing on him all at once. "He's a good man," Bill said, in the tone of someone clarifying something important. "Just, he doesn't know what to do with things he can't fix with his hands." Clara looked at the mountains outside the kitchen window. "I've met that kind before," she said. The notes appeared on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after she arrived. She was reorganizing the kitchen shelf. Not rearranging, just cleaning, making sure the provisions were properly sealed against mice, when she found the first one tucked behind a row of canning jars. It was folded twice into a small square, and the paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. She almost put it back without opening it. It wasn't hers. Then she saw the handwriting on the outside. Not a name, just a word. "Whoever." She opened it. "The oat crock needs to be kept on the right side of the shelf, away from the stove heat, or it goes rancid by February. The girls like cinnamon in their porridge, but Ethan won't eat it with cinnamon. He'll eat it if you put a little maple in instead. Cole takes his coffee black, but he'll drink it with cream if you don't give him the choice, and he won't mention it either way." Small things matter in this house. I hope you know that already. Clara stood with the note in her hands for a long time. Margaret Brennan. It had to be. The handwriting was clear and unhurried, the handwriting of a woman who had been organized and practical and who had known, apparently, that someone would come after her, that someone would stand in this kitchen and need to know these things. She folded the note back along its original creases and put it in her apron pocket. She found the second note the following week, tucked inside the cover of the household account book, a slim leather volume she'd been using to track provisions. This one was longer. Ethan will not ask for help, ever. If something is wrong with him, you will know it by the fact that he starts fixing things that aren't broken. He'll sharpen all the knives, he'll repair fence posts that don't need it, he'll find something to do with his hands that has nothing to do with what's actually wrong. When that happens, don't ask him directly. Ask him to help you with something instead. He needs to feel useful before he can feel anything else. Clara read it twice. She read it a third time. She thought about the morning she'd come into the kitchen and found Ethan sitting there at 4:30 with cold water and nothing to say. She thought about the way he'd told her about the pump, the trick of pushing down before pulling up, and the careful instruction not to tell Molly. He needs to feel useful before he can feel anything else. She put the note with the first one in the inside pocket of her coat, where they wouldn't get wet or crumpled. She started finding them regularly after that. Not everywhere. Margaret had been deliberate about placement, tucking each note in a location relevant to its content. One was inside the tin where she kept the children's medicine, written in a smaller, quicker hand that suggested some urgency at the time of writing. It listed each child's particular patterns with illness, that Molly always ran higher fevers than were actually dangerous, and that the danger was in letting her convince you she was fine when she wasn't. That Lily would stop eating when something was wrong before she would say anything. That Ethan, if sick enough to admit it, was genuinely sick enough to worry about. One was folded into the back of the Bible on the shelf in the main room. Clara didn't open the Bible. She found it when the Bible fell and the note slipped out. This one was about Cole. It was the most personal of any of them. He'll try to carry everything himself. He's been doing it since before I knew him. It isn't stubbornness exactly. It's that he genuinely doesn't know how to let anyone else take weight off him because no one taught him it was possible. Don't fight him on it. If you try to take something from him directly, he'll pull away. Set things down near him instead, close enough for him to reach, and let him come to it. He will. It just takes longer than you'd expect from a man who makes decisions quickly about everything else. Clara sat with this note for a long time. She was sitting in the kitchen, in the chair nearest the stove, and outside the window the Wyoming afternoon was going dark fast the way it did in deep winter, the sky pressing down gray and heavy. She had come to this house as something bought. She had fully understood herself in those terms for the first several weeks. A transaction, a function, a body doing the work that needed doing in exchange for food and shelter and the simple mercy of not being Harold Whitmore's burden anymore. Margaret Brennan's notes were changing that understanding into something she didn't yet have clean words for. This woman had known someone would come, had thought about what that person would need to know, had taken the time, during what must have been the worst period of her life, to write it down, tuck it away, give it freely to a stranger who would not arrive until after she was gone. What kind of woman did that? What kind of love for a family moved you to protect them even from death, even across the distance between living and not? Clara folded the note carefully and held it in both hands and sat in the warming kitchen and felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't known was sealed shut. She didn't tell Cole about the notes. Not yet. She wasn't sure how to, and she wasn't sure it was her place, and mostly she was still figuring out what they meant for how she moved through this house and these 4 people. What she did was use them. Quietly, carefully, the way you use a map that someone left for you. Not calling attention to the map itself, just moving more accurately because of it. When Ethan spent an entire Saturday afternoon rehanging a barn door that had been hanging fine, Clara went out with a broken harness buckle and asked him if he knew how to fix it. He did. He fixed it without speaking and then fixed 2 others she hadn't asked about, and by the time they came back inside, there was something slightly less rigid in the set of his shoulders. When Lily stopped eating for 2 days in the second week of February, Clara noticed before anyone else did. She didn't make a production of it. She made the things Lily liked, soft things, warm things, nothing that required much effort to eat. And she put them where Lily could reach them, and she sat nearby and read aloud from the one storybook in the house without being asked or expecting anything in return. By the third day, Lily ate her whole supper. Cole looked at the empty bowl, then at Clara. She met his eyes briefly and looked away. He didn't say anything, but she noticed that the next morning he'd restacked the firewood against the house wall so it was closer to the kitchen door and she'd have less distance to carry it in the cold. Small things. Margaret had been right about small things. Molly was the one who changed first, and in the way that 8-year-old girls change, suddenly, completely, then immediate denial of having changed at all. It happened over a dress. One of Molly's winter dresses had a tear in the side seam that had been getting worse for weeks, and Clara had been waiting for a signal that it was all right to mention it. One morning she came into the kitchen and found Molly trying to fix it herself, sitting on a kitchen chair with a needle and thread that was the wrong weight for the fabric, pulling the seam together with more determination than technique. Clara watched from the doorway. "The thread's too thin," she said. "It'll hold for a day and then pull through again." Molly looked up. Her expression cycled through about 4 things in 3 seconds: irritation, consideration, pride, practicality. "Do you have the right thread?" Molly asked. "In my room. Do you want me to get it?" Molly looked at the dress. Then she looked at the seam. "Yes," she said. Clara got the thread. She sat down across from Molly and showed her how to reinforce a seam that had already torn, not just closing it, but locking it at both ends so it wouldn't pull out again. Molly was sharp. She watched once, asked one question, and then did it herself with a steadiness of hand that Clara hadn't expected. "Who taught you to sew?" Clara asked. "My mother." Molly bit the thread off cleanly, the way someone had taught her to. She smoothed the seam with her thumb. "She was teaching me quilting too. We were doing a pattern." She stopped. The kitchen was quiet. "She hadn't finished showing me the corner method," Molly said. Her voice was careful and flat. "I don't know how to do the corners." Clara looked at the dress in Molly's hands. "I know one way," she said. "It might not be the same as your mother's way." Molly looked up. "But if you want to learn it," Clara said, "I can show you. And then when you have enough blocks, you'll have a quilt." Molly considered this with the gravity of a girl who understood exactly what was being offered and was deciding whether the offer was trustworthy. "Not today," she said finally. "Whenever you want," Clara said. "The offer doesn't expire." Molly folded the mended dress with a neatness that was entirely her own. She got up from the chair, went to her room, and Clara heard the door close softly behind her. Not a slamming door, soft. Clara sat in the empty kitchen and counted that as something real. Yeah. The trouble with Ethan came to a head in the last week of February, and it came in the form of a lie, which was something Clara had not expected from him. She had come to understand Ethan as a boy who stated hard truths directly. "She's the one you bought. Straight out, no flinching." So when she found out he'd been slipping his supper to the barn dogs, for how long she wasn't sure, but long enough that he'd grown visibly thinner across the face and she could see it in his coat, she was surprised that he'd chosen concealment over confrontation. She brought it to Cole in the evening after the children were in bed. This was the first time she'd come to him with something that wasn't a domestic matter, and she could see him register that. They sat at the kitchen table. She told him what she'd observed, quietly and without embellishment. Cole rubbed his face with both hands. He looked exhausted in a way that wasn't just tiredness, the exhaustion of someone who had been keeping vigil for too long. "How long?" he said. "At least 2 weeks, I think, maybe more." Cole was quiet for a moment. "He used to eat everything in sight, before." He didn't say before what. "Margaret used to say she couldn't keep food in the house with him around." Clara didn't answer. She waited. "I don't know how to talk to him about it," Cole said. It came out like a confession, a private thing admitted to the air more than to her. "I say the wrong things." He shuts down. "I try again." He goes further. He set his hands flat on the table. "I feel like I'm trying to coax a wild animal, and I'm making it worse every time." "He doesn't need coaxing," Clara said. Cole looked at her. "He needs to know you still see him," she said. "Not what he lost, not what you're afraid he's becoming. Him. The actual boy sitting in front of you." Cole's jaw worked for a moment. "I see him." "I know you do," Clara said. But he doesn't know it. He thinks you're looking at what's gone. The silence was long and particular. Outside, wind moved through the yard with a sound like water running fast. You've only been here 6 weeks, Cole said finally. I know. He looked at her in a way that was different from the sideways assessments of the previous weeks. More direct, something working behind his eyes. All right, he said. It wasn't agreement to anything specific. It was more like a decision made about a direction. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of Cole's voice in the yard, low and unhurried, and through her frosted window she could make out the two of them, Cole and Ethan, standing at the fence of the near pasture. Not working. Just standing. Cole's hand on the top rail and Ethan beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. She didn't know what was said. She didn't need to. When they came in for breakfast, Ethan ate 2 full servings of oatmeal and didn't speak much, but the set of his face had changed in some way that she couldn't have named precisely and didn't try to. The thaw came earlier than expected that year. Not warmth exactly, just a slight releasing of the cold's grip, the way winter sometimes loosens its hold for a week in late February before clamping back down. The snow in the yard turned soft on top while staying frozen underneath, and the children went outside after weeks of being largely trapped indoors. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Lily ran figure 8s in the yard with an abandon that 5-year-olds are capable of and no one else is, arms out, coat flying open, head tipped back. Molly followed at a more dignified pace that was still, despite itself, a form of joy. Ethan threw a stick for the barn dogs, throwing it harder than was necessary, the way boys release contained energy. And the dogs went after it with the wholehearted stupidity that dogs bring to sticks, and Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Clara turned back to the bread she was making and let herself have that small private thing, the satisfaction of a house that was slightly more alive today than it had been 6 weeks ago. Not because of her, not entirely. The children had done most of it themselves, the way grieving people eventually do. They had found their own ways toward living again. She had just tried very hard not to be in the way. The kitchen smelled like bread and coffee and wood smoke. Outside she could hear Lily laughing at the dogs. Then the kitchen door opened and Lily burst in, and her face was wrong. Not the face of a child who has hurt herself. Something different. Something white and strange. Miss Clara, Lily said. Her voice had no air in it. Clara turned from the bread. What's wrong? Lily swayed. It was a very slight movement, a tree in a light wind. And then her knees simply stopped working and she went down, and Clara crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and caught her before she hit the floor, and the child's skin under Clara's hand was so hot it felt wrong, felt like touching a pan that had been too close to the flame, and Clara's heart dropped straight through the floor of her chest. Ethan! She called, sharp and loud, loud enough to carry to the yard. She gathered Lily up and got her to the settee in the main room, and Lily's eyes were half open and glassy, and her breathing had that shallow, papery quality that Clara recognized from the winter her mother had been sick with fever, and she had been 13 years old and completely alone with it. Ethan came through the door, then Molly. They saw their sister on the settee, and both of them went very still in the particular way children go still when they've already lost someone. Ethan, Clara said, keeping her voice level, ride to get your father, now. Ethan didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He was out the door before she finished the sentence. Molly came to Clara's side. Her face was white and completely controlled. How bad? Molly asked. Clara looked at Lily's flushed face, felt the heat radiating off her, watched the shallow rise and fall of her small chest. She pressed the back of her hand to Lily's forehead again, and then her neck, and then the soft place inside her wrist. I don't know yet, Clara said. Get me every blanket in the house, and then put water on to boil. Molly went. Clara knelt beside Lily on the settee and brushed the damp hair from the child's forehead, and something in her chest went very quiet and very certain, the way it does when you understand that the next hours are going to require everything you have, and that falling apart is simply not one of the available options. Stay with me, sweetheart, she said quietly. I'm right here. Lily's eyes drifted toward her voice. The smallest possible recognition moved across her face. Outside she heard the sound of a horse being ridden fast toward the house, and the Brennan Ranch, which had just begun to breathe again, held itself very still and waited to see what came next. Cole came through the door at a run, which was the first time Clara had seen him move that way. He crossed the main room in 4 strides and dropped to his knees beside the settee and put his hand on Lily's face, and the sound he made, low, involuntary, barely audible, was the sound of a man who had already lost one person in this house and was not prepared to survive losing another. "How long has she been like this?" he said. "She collapsed maybe 20 minutes ago. The fever was already high when I felt her. She'd been outside. I didn't see it coming." Clara kept her voice steady. "Molly has water boiling. I need you to tell me if there's a doctor within reach." "Doc Harlan, 30 miles. Can you get him here by morning?" Cole looked at her. Then he looked at Lily. Then he stood up. "Bill," he said, already moving toward the door. "I need Bill to ride." He was back outside before the door had finished swinging. Clara heard him shouting across the yard, heard Bill's answering call from the direction of the barn, and then she stopped listening to what was happening outside and turned her full attention back to the child on the settee, because that was where she was needed, and everything outside that room was Cole's problem to solve. Molly appeared in the doorway with a bowl of hot water and a cloth, moving with the careful deliberateness of a girl who is frightened and has decided to be useful instead. Clara took the bowl from her without comment and began cooling Lily's face and neck and the insides of her wrists, working methodically, watching the child's breathing. "Is it the same fever?" Molly asked. She was standing very close, her arms pressed against her sides. "As Mama's?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She thought about the honest answer and the kind answer and found, looking at Molly's face, that this particular 8-year-old didn't need kind. She needed true. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "Every fever is different. Right now the most important thing is to bring the temperature down so her body isn't working so hard." "What can I do?" "Keep the water hot but not boiling. I'll need to change the cloths every few minutes." Clara looked at her. "Can you do that? Keep track of the time?" Molly straightened slightly. "Yes." "Good. That's your job." Ethan was in the doorway behind his sister. He'd come back in from the yard at some point. Clara hadn't heard him return. He stood there with his coat still on and his face doing the thing it did when he was containing something too large for his body. "Ethan," Clara said, "come hold her hand." He blinked. "She'll know you're here even if she can't show it," Clara said. "Come sit with her." He came into the room slowly and sat on the edge of the settee near Lily's feet, because the idea of holding her hand was apparently still one step further than he could manage. But proximity was something, and Clara accepted what was offered. The fever peaked in the middle of the night. Clara had known it would, had known the first several hours were about management, about holding the line, about not letting the fever climb into the range where the body starts damaging itself. She had sat through enough sick nights in her life, first with her mother, then alone during a bad winter at Harold's when she'd had influenza and there'd been no one to help her, to know that fevers had their own rhythm. They built, and they crested, and then they came down, or they didn't. This one built fast. By 10 in the evening, Lily was no longer drifting in and out, but fully insensible, her small body generating heat with a terrible mechanical relentlessness. And Clara stripped away the extra blankets despite every instinct that said cover a sick child and focused everything on keeping her temperature from climbing further. Cole sat on the other side of the settee. He had sent Molly and Ethan to bed at 9 over Ethan's protest, a sharp exchange that Clara heard from across the room and did not intervene in, because Cole needed to be able to make one decision in this house tonight, and that was the one available to him. After the children were in their rooms, Cole sat and watched his youngest daughter with an expression that Clara had to stop herself from looking at too directly. It was the face of a man in the process of being undone, and he was holding it together by the thinnest thread, and she understood instinctively that if she acknowledged what she was seeing, he would flinch away from it. She changed the cooling cloth. She checked Lily's pulse at her wrist. Fast, too fast, but steady. "Talk to her," Clara said. Cole looked up. "It helps." The sound of a familiar voice. She kept her eyes on Lily. "She won't remember it, but some part of her knows." Silence. "I don't—" Cole stopped. He tried again. "I don't know what to say." "Anything," Clara said. "What she did last week. What the dogs did in the yard today. It doesn't have to be important. It just has to be your voice." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice pitched low enough that it seemed almost like something private he was allowing her to overhear, he started talking. He talked about a morning 2 weeks ago when Lily had tried to teach the older barn dog to sit and had ended up sitting down herself in the snow in frustration, and the dog had sat down beside her, satisfied. He talked about the way she pronounced cinnamon, she dropped the second syllable entirely, had since she learned the word, and they'd never corrected it because none of them could stand to. He talked about a summer morning from before, when Margaret had been alive, when Lily had been 3 and had gotten into the flour and covered herself and the kitchen floor and the cat, somehow, all in the space of 10 minutes. His voice was very even while he told these things. Clara concentrated on the cooling cloth and let him talk and said nothing. Around midnight, the fever shifted. Clara felt it before she could measure it. A slight change in the quality of Lily's skin under her hands, a fraction less of that terrible dry heat. She checked the child's pulse again. Still fast, but the frantic quality had reduced by something she couldn't precisely quantify, but recognized. "I think it's turning," she said. Cole's hands, which had been resting on his knees, went very still. "I think," Clara said again, careful with the word. "Not certain, but I think so." Cole leaned forward and put his hand on Lily's forehead the way parents do, palm flat, a gesture that was measuring and tender at the same time. He kept it there for a long moment. When he sat back, his eyes were wet. He didn't do anything about it, and she didn't look directly at it. "I need more water," Clara said. "Hot, but not boiling. Would you make it?" He was grateful for the task. She could see it. He went to the kitchen and she sat with Lily, and the house was quiet around them, except for the fire and the wind and Lily's slightly easier breathing. By 2 in the morning, the fever had broken properly, a soaking sweat that meant the body was releasing what it had been fighting to hold, and Clara changed Lily's nightdress and the blanket beneath her, and settled her in clean, dry things, and Lily's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and far away, and then she exhaled slowly and went into a real sleep. Clara sat back on her heels and let out the breath she had been managing carefully for 6 hours. Cole was watching her from across the room. She didn't know how long he'd been looking at her that way. "She's going to be all right," Clara said. He nodded once. The muscle in his jaw worked. "You should sleep," Clara said. "I'll sit with her." "Clara, you have a ranch to run in 4 hours," she said. "I can sleep when Bill gets back with the doctor. Go." He stood. He was very still for a moment in the way he got when he was deciding something. "I don't know how to—" he started. "You don't need to," Clara said. "Go to bed, Cole." It was the first time she'd used his given name to his face. She realized it after she said it. He realized it too. She could see the slight register of it, but neither of them addressed it, and he went, and she turned back to Lily and the quiet room and the sound of a child sleeping soundly for the first time in hours. Doc Harlan arrived in the mid-morning, red-faced from the cold and his horse blowing steam in the yard. He examined Lily thoroughly, confirmed what Clara had already concluded, left instructions and a bottle of tonic, and told Cole in the plainest possible terms that someone had known what they were doing last night. Cole thanked him. After the doctor left, he came into the kitchen where Clara was eating her first proper meal since the previous morning. She'd forgotten to eat during the night, which happened to her when she was focused on something, and he sat down across from her without being asked. "Harlan said the fever could have gone another way," Cole said, "if it hadn't been managed the way it was." Clara kept eating. "It was managed." "I know." He was quiet a moment. "I want to say something." She looked up. "What you did last night." He stopped himself. Tried again with different words. "I couldn't have done that. Sat through that and kept my head." He looked at the table. "Margaret always said I was useless around sick children. I panic, and then I get angry at myself for panicking, and it doesn't help anyone." "You talked to her," Clara said. "That wasn't nothing." Cole said nothing. "She knew you were there," Clara said. "That matters." He was quiet for a moment longer. "Where did you learn it? How to manage a fever like that?" Clara considered. "My mother was sick for a long time before she died. I was 13 when it started." She turned her cup in her hands. "I had to learn." The kitchen was warm. From the main room they could hear the small sounds of Lily sleeping. "I'm sorry," Cole said, "about your mother." It was the first time since they'd arrived that he'd asked about her. She recognized that, and set it aside to look at later. "Thank you," she said. Lily recovered slowly, the way small children do, dramatic and complete in that way they have, where one morning she was pale and fragile, and by 3 days later she was trying to get outside in the cold and being firmly prevented. Clara made broth and soft things and read to her from the storybook, and on the fourth day Lily, unprompted, reached up and took Clara's hand while she was reading and held it. Clara kept reading. She didn't make anything of it. She just held on. Ethan watched this from the doorway. Clara saw him out of the corner of her eye and kept her eyes on the book and kept reading. And after a moment he went away, and she didn't know what it meant to him, only that he'd seen it. The second catastrophe arrived in the way that catastrophes on a working ranch do, without ceremony, without warning, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary afternoon. It was late March. The snow was still deep in the shadowed places, but the open ground was beginning to show through, and Cole and Bill and the two hands were working the far pasture, beginning the early season fence repairs that couldn't wait. Clara was in the kitchen. Molly was in her room. Lily, now fully recovered and apparently incapable of stillness, was somewhere outside in the yard. Ethan had gone to the south pasture. He shouldn't have. Cole had said clearly that the south pasture was off limits this time of year because the herd of wild mustangs that ranged through the territory sometimes came through that cut in the hills during the melt, following the snow line down. Clara hadn't been part of that conversation. She'd overheard it, but she'd understood the warning in Cole's voice when he said it. Ethan was 11, and he was feeling better than he had in months, and he went anyway. She was at the kitchen window when she saw the movement, far off, south pasture direction, something wrong in the quality of the motion, a disturbance in the open ground that resolved itself as she leaned closer to the glass, into the sight of horses. Many of them, moving fast. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing for 2 or 3 seconds. Then she did. She was out the door before she'd consciously decided to move. The mustangs, 20, maybe 25, were pouring through the gap in the south pasture fence in a panicked river of muscle and noise, the particular chaos of a herd that has been startled and is running blind. And in the middle of the south pasture, she could see the small figure of Ethan, who had apparently frozen rather than run, the way people sometimes do when their brain processes danger faster than their legs can respond. "Ethan!" she screamed. The word tore out of her throat. He heard her. She saw him move. And the movement was wrong, too late, in the wrong direction. And then the leading edge of the herd was on him, and she watched him go down, and her heart stopped and she ran. She ran the way she hadn't run since she was a child, the kind of running that uses everything, the kind that doesn't save anything for the way back. Behind her she heard Molly calling from the house, heard the distant sound of Bill's voice from somewhere. Heard nothing after that because the blood in her ears was too loud. The mustangs had passed by the time she reached Ethan. They'd pushed through the pasture and were already moving away down the cut, the sound of them fading. The pasture was torn up. The mud churned to chaos where the herd had passed. Ethan was on the ground. He was conscious. That was the first thing she clocked, the thing her whole body oriented toward. He was conscious. His eyes were open. He was trying to push himself up and couldn't. "Don't move," she said. She dropped to her knees beside him in the mud. "Stay still, Ethan. Look at me." He looked at her. His face was white and smeared with dirt, and his eyes were wrong. Too bright, too large. The eyes of a boy in serious pain who is trying very hard not to show it. "What hurts?" she said. "My arm," he said. His voice was remarkably steady for someone on the ground. "And my side." "Which side?" "Left." She looked at his left arm without touching it yet. The angle wasn't right. She had seen enough to know what she was looking at, and the knowledge sat in her chest cold and certain. "I need to check your ribs," she said. "I'm going to put my hand on your left side, very gently. Tell me where it hurts worst." She pressed carefully, working from below the armpit down, and Ethan's breath went sharp and caught at the third and fourth ribs from the top. "There?" she said. "Yeah," he managed. She sat back on her heels and looked at his arm again, and then at his face, and she made herself think clearly and quickly because she could hear Molly coming across the pasture behind her, and she needed to have a plan before Molly got close enough to see Ethan's face fully and panic. "Ethan," she said, "I'm going to tell you the truth because I think you'd rather have it." His jaw was very tight. "Okay. Your arm is broken. I think your ribs are cracked, at least 2 of them. We need to get you to the house, and we need to splint the arm and wrap your side, and we need to get your father." She held his eyes. "It's going to hurt to move. I won't pretend it isn't, but you can do it." He stared at her. His throat worked. "Can you?" she said. "Yeah," he said. Came out rough but definite. "Good." She looked back toward the house. Molly had stopped at the pasture fence, which was still standing on this side. The herd had come through a gap further down. Clara held up one hand toward Molly. "We need a board from the barn. A flat one, not too wide. And rope. Can you find that?" Molly, 30 yards away, looked at her brother and then back at Clara. Her face went through several things in rapid succession and then settled into the expression Clara was coming to recognize. The deliberate composure of a girl who had decided the most useful thing she could be was calm. "Yes," Molly called back. "I'll get it." She ran. Clara turned back to Ethan. He was still on the ground, still maintaining that tight, careful stillness that told her his ribs were making every breath an exercise in management. "She did that," Ethan said. "Found stuff like that. When something was wrong." It took Clara a moment to understand who he meant. "Your mother," Clara said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a second. "She didn't fall apart either." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the sky, not avoiding her, just somewhere else for a moment, somewhere in his own head. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Clara said. Ethan said nothing, but the line of his body shifted slightly, some small amount of the rigidity going out of it, and she understood that what she'd said had landed somewhere important. Getting Ethan back to the house took 40 minutes, and was one of the harder things Clara had done in a life that had contained several hard things. She improvised a splint from Molly's board and strips of cloth, stabilized his arm against his body, and they moved him in stages. Stand, pause, breathe, 5 steps, pause, breathe. While Molly walked alongside carrying everything Clara asked for, and Ethan kept his teeth together and didn't make a sound except for the one moment when he caught his foot on uneven ground and jolted, and then he made a sound that was brief and involuntary and cost him something visible. "Almost," Clara said. "Keep going." "I know," he said. She believed him. Bill arrived at the edge of the pasture at some point during the return crossing. She heard him shouting, heard him coming, and called out to him without stopping. He appeared on Ethan's other side, and between the two of them they got the boy the rest of the way to the house without incident. Cole rode in 40 minutes after they'd gotten Ethan settled. He came through the door already knowing something was wrong. Bill must have sent one of the hands out to the far pasture. He took in the scene in the main room in one look. Ethan on the settee that had been Lily's 2 weeks ago, arms splinted and bound, face chalky, Clara on a low stool beside him with a bowl of water and more cloth. Cole crossed the room. He crouched down next to his son. "I'm all right," Ethan said before Cole could speak. Cole put his hand on the boy's head. Not the arm, not the broken thing, just the top of his head, and kept it there for a moment. "South pasture," Cole said. Ethan met his father's eyes. "I know. We'll talk about it when you're better." "I know," Ethan said again. Cole stood. He looked at Clara, at the splint, at the wrapping around Ethan's ribs, at the setup of what she'd needed and what she'd done. "He needs a doctor," Clara said. "The arm needs to be set properly. I've stabilized it, but I can't set a break. And the ribs need to be confirmed. There may be 3 rather than 2. Cole nodded. "I'll go for Harlan myself." "Don't run the horse to death," Clara said. "Ethan is stable. A few more hours won't change the arm." Cole looked at her in a way that she was becoming familiar with. The look that meant he was taking in more than just the surface of what she'd said. He nodded again. Before he went back out the door, he stopped. He turned around and looked at Clara for a moment in the slanting afternoon light coming through the main room window. "Bill said you ran," he said. She looked at him. "Across the pasture. He said he saw you from the far fence. Running." Clara said nothing. Something moved through Cole's expression that she couldn't name cleanly. Something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite something else, but was a combination of all of those things, and it lasted only a moment before he put it away. "Thank you," he said, the same 2 words he'd used after Lily's fever. But they meant something different now. She could hear it. They were heavier. They carried more weight, and she wasn't sure what that meant yet, but she held it and said nothing. He went. Doc Harlan came and set the arm and confirmed 3 cracked ribs and told Ethan he'd been remarkably lucky, which Ethan received with the stoicism of a boy who was beginning to understand that luck and good management were sometimes related. The following days settled into the rhythm of nursing, which Clara was by now almost grimly experienced at. Ethan was a better patient than she'd expected, not because he was easy, but because he was disciplined. He chafed at the stillness, clearly, but he didn't fight it the way she'd braced for. He lay on the settee and read from the few books in the house, and allowed Lily to sit next to him and talk without end, which seemed to cost him almost nothing, and seemed to give Lily a great deal. On the 3rd day, Ethan said, without preamble and without looking at her, "I heard you, when you shouted my name." Clara was wrapping his arm in a fresh bandage. "Good, you moved. Not fast enough." "Fast enough to not be dead," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "I froze first. For about 2 seconds I just stopped." "That happens." "It's stupid." "It's human," Clara said. 2 seconds is fast. Most people freeze longer." She tied off the bandage. "You moved when it counted." He looked at her for the first time since she'd started speaking. His dark eyes were very direct. 11 years old and already looking at the world with the deliberateness of someone twice his age. "Mama Clara," Lily said from the armchair across the room, where she had been building something from sticks and string and appeared to be only half listening to anything. The room went quiet. Clara had heard it. Ethan had heard it. They both looked at Lily, who was entirely absorbed in her stick construction and apparently hadn't noticed what she'd said. Clara looked at Ethan. His expression was something she couldn't easily catalog. Not hostile, not warm, something more complicated and more private than either. "She's been saying it for a couple days," he said, quietly. "When you're not in the room." He held her gaze for one long moment. "I didn't tell her to stop." Clara turned back to the bandage, straightening an edge that didn't need straightening. "Thank you," she said. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and Lily kept building her little structure of sticks across the room without any idea that she had just done something that neither of them would forget. Cole heard it for the first time 4 days later. Lily called it across the kitchen without thinking about it. "Mama Clara, is there more bread?" The way children say things when names have become automatic. When a person has moved from category to person in the way people do when you're 5 and your world is the size of a ranch house, and someone has been reliable enough for long enough. Cole was sitting at the kitchen table. Clara was at the stove. The word landed in the room between them, and neither of them moved. Clara kept her eyes on the stove. She cut a piece of bread and handed it down to Lily, and said, "Here you go, sweetheart," and Lily took it and went, satisfied. Clara didn't turn around. The kitchen was quiet behind her in a specific way, the quiet of someone sitting very still with something working through them. After a long moment, Cole said, "Are you all right with that?" She turned around. I was looking at her with that careful directness he sometimes employed when he thought the thing he was asking might break something. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He looked at his coffee cup. "She doesn't mean—" he started. "I know what she means," Clara said. "I know what I am and what I'm not." She held his eyes steadily. "I'm not trying to be anything I'm not." Cole looked at her for a moment longer. "I know," he said, and then, lower, "That's the thing." She didn't know what to do with that, and he didn't explain it, and the kitchen went back to its ordinary sounds, and outside the Wyoming spring was beginning to come up through the mud, and the cold was losing, slowly, the grip it had held all winter long. The thing about That's the Thing was that it stayed with Clara longer than she expected. She turned it over in her head the way you turn a stone you've found on unfamiliar ground. Not sure what you're looking at, not sure if it matters, unable to put it down entirely. Cole had said it and then moved away from it, the way he moved away from most things that got too close to the interior of him, and she had let him, because pushing Cole Brennan toward anything before he was ready was like pushing a fence post into frozen ground. You could do it, but you'd break something in the process. April came in with mud and fitful sunshine and the particular chaos of a working ranch in spring, calving season, fence repairs, the first real assessment of what the winter had cost them. Cole was outside before dawn most mornings, and some nights she heard him come in well after she'd gone to sleep. The ranch was his in the way that things are yours when they've also nearly destroyed you. bone deep and complicated and not entirely separable from grief. Clara ran the house. She did it the way she'd been doing it since February, with the same deliberate consistency, the same refusal to take up more space than she'd earned. But something had shifted in the architecture of the household. Some load-bearing thing had moved, and she could feel it without being able to point to exactly when it had changed. Ethan's arm healed. The cast came off in mid-April, and he spent 3 days flexing his fingers with the obsessive regularity of a boy rediscovering a tool he'd been denied, and then he went back to work alongside his father and Bill, as though the South pasture and the Mustangs and the 6 weeks of enforced stillness had simply been something to get through and were now behind him. He didn't bring it up, and neither did Cole, though Clara suspected the conversation that had been deferred during recovery had happened at some point, privately, between father and son, in the way their most important conversations seemed to, outdoors, in motion, not looking directly at each other. What changed with Ethan was subtle but real. He started telling her things. Not personal things, not yet. Practical things. The things he knew about the ranch that she didn't. He told her which of the hens was laying and which had stopped and wasn't going to start again. He told her the well ran slightly sulfurous in spring and you needed to let the bucket sit before you used the water for cooking. He told her the bay horse near the barn gate was unpredictable and she should always approach from the left. Each piece of information was, in isolation, just a fact. Taken together, they were something else. They were a boy gradually including her in his understanding of the place he loved. She received each one the same way she'd received his pump trick in the dark kitchen in January, directly, without making too much of it, filing it away and using it. Molly, meanwhile, had asked about this quilting. She'd done it indirectly, the way Molly did most things that mattered to her. Arrived in the kitchen one Saturday afternoon while Clara was mending and stood near the table for a minute without speaking until Clara looked up. "I found the blocks," Molly said, "from the quilt my mother started. They're in her work basket." Clara set down her mending. "Do you want to get them?" Molly went and came back with a flat wicker basket containing 12-pieced quilt blocks in shades of blue and yellow, neatly stacked, each one pressed and finished. Clara looked at them without touching until Molly put them on the table between them. "She finished these herself," Molly said. "I watched her do some of them. The corner method she was showing me is, I know the idea, but I couldn't—" She stopped. Clara picked up one of the blocks and turned it over. Margaret's stitching was even and close, the work of someone who'd been doing it since childhood. "This corner method," Clara said. "Can you show me what she'd done so far? Even part way?" Molly pulled out a partially assembled section, 3 blocks joined, the 4th begun. She spread it out and pointed to the corner join her mother had started, explaining in halting technical language what she understood the intention to be. Clara looked at it for a while. "I think I see what she was doing," she said slowly. "I do it differently. My way makes a slightly thicker seam, but if you want to finish it the way she was going, I think we can figure it out from this." Molly looked at the partial section. "You'd try to do it her way?" "It's her quilt," Clara said. "It should be finished her way." The expression that moved through Molly's face was not gratitude exactly. It was more like something settling into place, some internal weight redistributing itself slightly. They spent that Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table working it out together, making mistakes and unpicking them and trying again, and it was not smooth, and it was not sentimental. And at one point Molly said, "This is harder than it looks," with the flat irritation of someone who'd been wrong about their own competence. And Clara said, "Yes, it is," without softening it. And somehow the simple acknowledgement without comfort, was what made Molly stay at the table and keep working. But Cole noticed the quilt blocks on the table that evening when he came in. He stopped. Clara saw him see them. He didn't say anything. He poured his coffee and sat at the far end of the table, and the blocks sat there between him and the empty chair across from him. And something moved through his face that Clara looked away from because it was too private to witness. Later, when the children were in bed, she gathered the blocks and returned them carefully to Molly's work basket. She was coming back through the main room when Cole spoke from the chair near the window where he'd been sitting in the dark for the better part of an hour. "Did Molly ask you?" Clara stopped. "She did." "How did it go?" "We're working it out," Clara said. "Her mother had a method I haven't seen before. We're trying to reconstruct it from what was started." Cole was quiet. "I hope that's all right," Clara said. "It's more than all right." His voice was low and a little rough. I didn't know what to do with that basket. I didn't want to put it away, and I didn't know how to. I couldn't just sit down with her, and he stopped, tried a different entry point. Margaret was the one who knew how to do those things with them, the patient things, the sitting things. A pause. I'm better at the moving things. You're better at both than you think, Clara said. She heard him shift in the chair. You don't have to say that, he said. I know, she said. I don't say things I don't mean. You've been here long enough to know that. The dark room was quiet. From outside, the sound of frogs. There were frogs now, in the low, marshy ground near the eastern pasture, a sound she'd come to associate with April on this particular piece of land. I need to ask you something, Cole said. She waited. Do you want to stay here past the spring? Clara stood very still. What do you mean? I mean, he stopped. I told you in Missouri that I needed help with the household. I didn't tell you how long. I should have been clearer. She understood then. He was trying to give her an exit, and he was doing it badly, and she couldn't tell if that was because he wanted her to take it or because he needed to offer it and hoped she wouldn't. Do you want me to leave? She asked. No. The word was immediate. Then, as though he felt the immediacy of it required some management, the children need... Cole. He stopped. Do you want me to leave? A longer silence. Outside, the frogs. No, he said again, and this time he didn't add anything to it. Clara let out a careful breath. Then I'd like to stay, she said, if the terms are fair. What terms do you want? She thought about it. I'd like to be able to make decisions about the house without having to ask for each one. I'm good at this, and I know it, and I need to be trusted to do it. Done, he said without hesitation. And I'd like... She stopped, reconsidered. What? I'd like to keep finding the notes, she said. Your wife's notes. I've found several. I've been using them. She paused. I should have told you sooner. The silence was longer this time. What notes? Cole said. So she told him. She described where she'd found them, what they'd said, how she'd used them. She kept her voice even and practical, the same way she described anything important. She did not look at him while she talked. When she finished, the room was very quiet. I didn't know she'd done that, Cole said. I thought you might not. She never said, he exhaled. That's Margaret. She'd have planned for everything. She'd have thought about it and decided what the next person would need and just... His voice went briefly rough, and he stopped, and she heard him put it away, the way he put things away. Did you keep them? Yes, in my coat pocket. I'd like to read them sometime, he said. Not now, but sometime. Whenever you want, Clara said. She went to bed not long after. She lay in her room off the kitchen, the room that had been her cell in the beginning and had, at some point she couldn't pinpoint, become simply her room. And she looked at the ceiling and thought about, do you want me to leave? And no, and the particular quality of that word, said twice, with nothing after it the second time. She was not a girl who built castles from single syllables. She had learned early that hope constructed from too little evidence was just a different kind of suffering. But she also knew the difference between a man being polite and a man telling the truth when it cost him something, and Cole Brennan had been telling the truth. She turned over and went to sleep. The wildflowers came up in the second week of May, small and determined in the way of things that have survived a Wyoming winter, yellows and pale purples pushing up through the pasture grass on the south side of the property. Clara noticed them on a Tuesday morning when she was hanging washing and thought of Margaret, because the south pasture was where Margaret was buried, under a stone that Cole had quarried and set himself, in a spot she'd apparently chosen herself the summer before she got sick. Clara had never gone to that part of the property. She had understood without being told that it wasn't hers to go to. She was thinking about all of this, standing at the washing line with the wet shirt in her hands, when she heard Cole behind her. Come with me, he said. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the yard with his hat in his hand, which was unusual. Cole wore his hat the way other men wore their skin, and his expression was doing something complicated and deliberate. Where? She said. South pasture. She hung the shirt. She went with him. The walk was 10 minutes. They didn't speak on the way. The spring grass was wet and long and soaked their boots through, and the mountains were very clear in the morning air, the snow on their upper faces brilliant in the early sun. Margaret's marker was simple and well made, a rectangle of pale stone set flush in the ground with her name and dates carved into it. Someone, Cole presumably, or maybe all of them, had put wildflowers on it recently. They were still fresh. Clara stood at a respectful distance. Cole stopped near the marker and stood looking at it for a moment. "I come out here sometimes in the morning," he said, "before the day starts. I don't talk to her. I'm not much for that. I just stand here." Clara said nothing. "I wanted to bring you here," he said. "I should have done it sooner. You should know where she is." He looked at the stone. "She'd have wanted you to know." "How do you know that?" Clara said. "Because she left you instructions." Something shifted in his voice. "She left you more care than she left anyone except her own children. That's Margaret telling me something." Clara looked at the stone, at Margaret Brennan's name carved in the pale rock, the dates that showed a life too short, a woman who had made plans for strangers out of love for the family she was leaving behind. "She sounds like someone worth missing," Clara said. "She was." Cole's jaw worked once. "She was impatient. She talked too fast, and she always knew she was right, even when she wasn't, and she never, ever asked for help when she needed it, and it drove me half out of my mind every winter for 9 years. His voice had gone quieter. I'd give most things to hear her talk too fast at me right now." Clara didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. "I don't tell you this to—" Cole stopped, looked at her sideways. "I'm not trying to tell you about her to put distance between us. I want to be clear about that." Clara looked at him. "Then what are you telling me?" He looked back at the marker. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, that he might fold it back up inside himself and they'd walk back to the house and carry on as they had been, the two of them in adjacent orbits, close enough to feel the pull and carefully not naming it. But he didn't fold it up. "I've been watching you for 4 months," he said. "I've been watching you manage my household and manage my children and manage me. Don't argue. You do. Not in a way I mind. And I've watched you do it without asking for a single thing for yourself and without making anyone feel managed." He turned to look at her fully. "I didn't buy help. I know that now. I don't know what I'd call what you are to this family, but I know it isn't that." Clara's chest was very tight. "I'm not good at this," he said. "In case you haven't noticed." "I've noticed," she said. Something that might have been the first real humor she'd seen from him moved through his expression. It lasted about a second. Then it went serious again. "I don't want to say something to you that isn't true," he said. "So I'm going to say exactly what I know for certain." He held her eyes. "I know that I don't want you to leave. I know that when Lily got sick and when Ethan went down, you were the thing that held this family together. And it wasn't because you'd been paid to. People quit things they've been paid to do all the time. You didn't. And I know that when I come in at the end of a day that's tried to kill me, the thing I want most is to sit in a room that you're in." Clara was very still. I know it's not what a person's supposed to say," Cole said. "I'm not a poet. I can't say it better than that." "I don't need poetry," Clara said. He looked at her, waiting. 4 months ago," she said, "you told me you didn't need love, that you just needed someone to keep your household alive." "I know what I said." "I believed you," she said. "So I came here and I did that. I kept the household alive." She looked at him steadily. "But somewhere in between the fever and the mud and Ethan's arm and the notes in your wife's handwriting telling me how to reach all of you, somewhere in there it stopped being what I'd been paid to do." Cole waited. "I didn't come here with anything to lose," Clara said. "I had $10 and my mother's quilt and a very thorough understanding of what it feels like to be worth nothing to the people who should value you." She held his gaze. "This family made me worth something again, not because anyone tried to, just by needing things I was able to give." Her voice was steady. She'd had this conversation in her head enough times to know how to keep it steady. "I'm not choosing you because I don't have anywhere else to go. I want to be clear about that. I'm choosing this because it's the first place I've been where I belong." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." The way he'd said no. Simple, direct, with everything underneath it. "Okay," Clara said back. They stood beside Margaret's marker in the May morning with the wildflowers coming up in the wet grass around them. and the mountains white above them, and neither of them knew exactly what came next, only that it was going to be chosen, by both of them, with their eyes open, and that the choosing mattered in a way that nothing transactional ever could. They told the children that evening, after supper. Clara had expected resistance. She had braced for it from Ethan specifically, had run through several versions of the conversation in her head during the afternoon. She had been wrong before about the children, and she expected she might be wrong again, but she also understood that some things couldn't be approached indirectly. Some things had to be said plainly and then given room. Cole said it plainly. He sat at the kitchen table with all three of them and said that he and Clara were going to be married, and that he wanted them to know first, and that they could say what they thought about it. Lily said, "I know." They all looked at her. She was eating the last of her supper with complete tranquility, apparently unmoved. "You know," Cole said. "Mama Clara is already here," Lily said, in the tone of someone explaining something self-evident to a slower audience. "She's always here." Cole looked at Clara. Clara looked at the table. Molly was quiet for a while. She had the expression she wore when she was sorting through something. Internal, contained, deliberate. Finally she said, "Will we still work on the quilt?" "Yes," Clara said. "That doesn't change." Molly nodded once. She seemed to feel that was the important question. Ethan said nothing for a long time. Long enough that the table got quiet around his silence, and Clara could feel Cole beside her holding himself carefully still, not pressing, the way she'd taught him. Set things down near him and let him come to it. "She's not replacing her," Ethan said finally. "Not a question." "No," Cole said. Ethan looked at Clara. The dark eyes, direct as always, 11 years old and carrying something much older. "You're not trying to be her," he said. "No," Clara said. You're Clara." "That's right." He looked at her for another moment. Something moved through his face that was private and complete, and she didn't try to read it. "Okay," he said, and went back to his supper. They married on a Saturday morning in late May, with the wildflowers fully up in the south pasture and the mountains reflecting light, and Bill and the two hands standing in a row near the fence, because Clara had quietly asked Bill if they'd like to be there, and Bill had said, "Yes, ma'am, we surely would," in a tone that suggested she'd asked something that mattered. The ceremony was short. A traveling judge who came through the territory did the words, and they said what needed to be said, and Cole put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, which she hadn't known was coming and which arrived as its own particular thing that she'd need to think about later. Lily held a fistful of wildflowers she'd picked herself and lost several of them during the ceremony and didn't care. Molly stood very straight and watched with the serious attention she brought to anything important. Ethan stood on Cole's other side. At the moment when the judge said, "I now pronounce," and Cole turned to face Clara and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen from him before, something unguarded and real and a little unsteady. Ethan reached over without any announcement and took his father's hand. Cole's hand closed around his son's. Clara watched this happen and said nothing, and felt something break open in her chest with the clean, uncomplicated force of a thing that simply is what it is. Not complicated, not earned through some sophisticated emotional labor, just real. A man and his boy standing together in a May morning, and her standing opposite them, and the mountains behind her going up into the blue. The judge finished. Cole kissed her once, briefly, and it was not the practiced ease of someone who'd done it before. It was careful and a little bit awkward and completely sincere, which was more than enough. Bill started clapping. The hands joined in. Lily started clapping too, got confused about the rhythm, and ended up just hitting her own hands together happily until Molly put an arm around her, more to stop the noise than out of affection, though it looked like both. That afternoon, while Cole was occupied at the barn with Bill and the children were somewhere in the yard, Clara went to the south pasture. She stood at Margaret's marker for a while. She'd brought wildflowers, the same kind Lily had carried that morning, yellow and purple, the ones that came up in the wet grass after winter. She set them on the stone. She didn't speak. She was not particularly a woman who spoke to markers, but she stood there for a while in the May afternoon and thought about a woman who had written notes to strangers and tucked them in canning jars and household ledgers, and had thought, even while dying, about what the people she loved would need after she was gone. She thought about what it meant to step into a life that someone else had built and vacated. Not to take it over, not to replace anything, but to be allowed to add to it, to be trusted with it. She set her hand briefly on the top of the stone, the way you set your hand on something that deserves acknowledgement. Then she walked back to the house, her house now, her family now, her piece of this hard and enormous country, and pushed through the kitchen door into the smell of the bread she'd left rising, and heard somewhere in the house the sound of Lily's voice and Molly's answering it, and below that the particular sound of Ethan's boots on the back step, coming in from the yard, the sound of a boy coming home. She went to the stove and got the fire going and started on supper, the same as she did every day, the same ordinary work of feeding people who depended on her, except that nothing was the same as before, and the ordinariness of it was the best part, the part that meant something had truly taken hold. Cole came in an hour later. He hung his hat. He poured himself coffee and then, without any announcement, poured a second cup and set it on the counter near where she was working. She picked it up. They stood in the kitchen together in the evening light while supper came together on the stove, and they didn't need to say anything, and the silence between them was the kind that takes months to build, the kind that means you're with someone, not just near them. Outside, the Wyoming mountains held the last of the day's light on their upper faces, cold and clear and permanent above the ranch, where a broken family had, by ordinary means and stubborn work, and something that resisted any cleaner name, become whole again. The summer after the wedding was the first season Clara experienced the ranch as something that belonged to her rather than something she was managing on behalf of someone else, and the difference was not small. It showed up in the way she moved through the house, less careful, less calibrated, less of the constant low-level monitoring she'd been doing since January, checking the temperature of every room she entered, measuring how much space she was taking. She still worked the same hours, still cooked and preserved and mended and kept the accounts. But there was a quality of ease underneath it now, the way a body moves differently when it's not braced for impact. Cole noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. Cole rarely named the interior things directly. But one morning in early June, he came in from the barn earlier than usual and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment while she was working, and something in his expression was quiet and certain, the look of a man who has found what he was looking for without having known he was looking. "Good morning," she said, not turning around. "Morning," he said. He poured his coffee and sat down and opened the week's accounts, which she'd left on the table, and that was all. But the morning felt different, felt inhabited in a way that the long winter mornings had not. The children moved differently too that summer. Lily had crossed some invisible threshold from baby to small person. She had opinions now, stated loudly, about everything from what she wanted for breakfast to the correct way to name the ranch cats. And the opinions were frequently wrong, but delivered with such complete confidence that they were hard to argue against directly. Clara had stopped trying. She'd learned to redirect rather than contradict, a technique she suspected Margaret had also used and which produced less drama and comparable results. Molly finished the quilt in July. It took 3 Saturday afternoons beyond the first one, and the corners were not identical. 2 of them had a slight asymmetry that Molly discovered on the final afternoon and regarded with a focused displeasure for a full 10 minutes before Clara said, "Your mother's corners aren't identical either," and showed her the slight variation in 2 of Margaret's original blocks. Molly looked at this for a while. "She didn't fix it," Molly said. "No." "Why not?" "Maybe she didn't think it needed fixing," Clara said. "Or maybe she decided it was part of how it was made." Molly pressed her hand flat against the finished quilt. It was a gesture so like the one Clara had seen Margaret's notes describe. She puts her hand flat against things she's decided about, her father does the same, that Clara had to look away for a moment. The quilt went on Molly's bed. Clara made no ceremony of it, and neither did Molly. But that night, Cole stopped in the doorway of Molly's room and stood looking at it on her bed, and he was there for long enough that Clara, passing in the hall, noticed. She kept walking. The letter arrived in August. Clara recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she turned it over. She'd looked at that handwriting on enough account ledgers and household receipts to know it in the dark. Harold Whitmore. Return address, Jefferson County, Missouri. She stood at the kitchen table holding the envelope for a while. Then she opened it. The letter was short. Harold had never been a man of many words, which was one of the few things she'd almost respected about him. Clara. I am writing because I have been unwell this spring past, and the doctor says it is likely to continue. I am not asking for anything. I want you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. I knew it at the time. That is all I have to say. I hope you are well. Harold. She read it twice. She set it on the table. She stood in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything. The thing about Harold's letter was not what it said. The thing about it was what it cost her to receive it, how complicated the receiving was, how many different and contradictory things moved through her at the same time. Anger, yes, still, the cold, specific anger of someone who has been treated as property by a person who should have been protection. But also something else, something she hadn't expected, something that was almost pity, which disturbed her more than the anger did because pity was harder to manage and harder to justify. She was still standing there when Cole came in for the midday meal. He saw the letter on the table and looked at her face and said nothing, just poured water from the pitcher and sat down and waited. Clara told him what the letter said. Cole was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? I don't know yet. You don't have to do anything. I know. She sat down across from him. That's the problem. When I don't have to do anything, I have to actually decide instead of just reacting. Cole looked at the letter. He sold you, he said. Flat, not heated. Like I said, I bought you. I haven't forgotten that. Neither have I. Whatever you decide about him, Cole said, I'll back it. She looked at him. What if I decided to go see him? Cole met her eyes without flinching. I'd ask you to wait until after harvest, he said, and then I'd drive you myself. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some resistance, maybe. Some of the possessiveness that men who'd been through loss sometimes developed around the people they'd found again. You do that, she said. He's the only family you've got left, Clara, whatever he did. Cole looked at his hands. I know what it's like to have people not there anymore. I wouldn't take that choice away from you. She looked at the letter on the table. The short lines in Harold's crabbed handwriting. I knew it at the time. She thought about what it meant to be 18 years old and handed to a stranger for $40 and 2 head of cattle, and what it meant that the man who'd done it was sick now, alone in a Missouri house, writing 3 paragraphs on a piece of paper because the doctor had told him something he wasn't ready to hear. She thought about Margaret's notes, tucked in canning jars, written for strangers out of love. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be. Not in the abstract, but practically, specifically, the actual person she was going to be for the next 30 or 40 years of her life in this place. After harvest, she said. Cole nodded. Harvest came and went the way it does on a working ranch, total, consuming, leaving very little room for anything else. Clara and Molly put up enough preserved food to last through the following spring, a process that took 3 weeks of near-continuous work and left Clara's hands rough and stained and her back consistently unhappy. She didn't complain. She'd complained about less important things in Harold's house, where at least the complaining had gone nowhere, and here there was too much to do for the energy it would cost. Ethan worked the harvest alongside Cole and Bill with a seriousness that still occasionally caught Clara off guard. He was 12 now, and 12 on a Wyoming ranch in 1883 was not the same as 12 in a Missouri town. He'd been given real responsibilities, not make work, not manage tasks, but actual things that needed doing and would suffer if done badly. And he'd grown into them with the gravity of a boy who understood that being trusted was the most important thing he'd been given. He still didn't call her Mama Clara. She didn't expect him to. That was Lily's word, which had never been assigned or negotiated. Lily had simply arrived at it and stayed there, with the serene certainty of a 5-year-old who has decided how the world is organized. What Ethan called her was Clara, which was her name, and he said it the way he said his father's name, directly, without decoration, in the voice of someone who means what they say. That was more than enough. Molly called her Clara too, which had shifted naturally somewhere around May without anyone making a decision about it. She'd been Miss Clara through the winter and into the spring, and then one morning Molly had said, Clara, the chickens are out, urgent, no ceremony, and it had been Clara ever since. These were small things. Clara had learned to pay attention to small things. They drove to Missouri in October, she and Cole. They left the children with Bill, who received this assignment with the stoic acceptance of a man who has made his peace with all manner of things. Ethan told Bill firmly that the chickens needed watching in the morning, and that Lily was not to be allowed near the north fence because the new colt was unpredictable, and Bill said yes, sir, without irony, and Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable at being sirred, which Clara found satisfying. The drive took 3 days. Cole was good company on the road in the particular way of people who don't feel the need to fill silence. He talked when he had something to say and didn't when he didn't, and he was observant in a way that surprised her, noting things along the way that she hadn't expected him to notice. The way the light changed as they came down out of the higher country. The difference in the smell of the air when they crossed into flatter land. "You don't miss it," he said on the second day. Not a question. "Missouri?" Clara looked at the flat country around them. "No." "What do you miss?" "About before." She thought about it honestly. "My mother," she said. "Not the place. Not Harold. Just her." Cole nodded. "What was she like?" Clara looked at the road ahead. "Patient," she said. "Quieter than me. She let things come to her rather than going after them, which used to frustrate me when I was young." She paused. "I understand it better now." "Came to it yourself," Cole said. "The hard way." "That's the only way any of us come to anything worth knowing," Cole said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road, hat brim low against the autumn sun. "That might be the most philosophical thing you've said in 10 months, she said. Something that was definitely a smile moved at the corner of his mouth and then went. "Don't tell Bill. He already thinks I'm going soft." "Bill thinks you hung the moon," Clara said. "Bill's known me 20 years. He knows better." She smiled and looked back at the road and thought that she was, despite everything, despite the direction they were traveling and the reason they were going, genuinely content. Not the relieved contentment of someone who has survived something, but the actual ordinary contentment of a person who is where they're supposed to be, going somewhere difficult with someone solid beside them. Harold's house was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed when Cole turned the wagon onto the familiar road. The house had shrunk, or the world had expanded around it, or she had grown in some way that wasn't about height. She'd written ahead to say she was coming. She hadn't said she was bringing anyone. Harold came to the door before they'd finished tying the horse. He looked older and worse than she'd expected. The illness had taken something from him physically, some of the broad solidity she associated with him, and he stood in the doorway with a careful quality she'd never seen in him before, as though he wasn't sure of his welcome. He looked at Cole, then at Clara, then at the ring on her left hand. "You married," he said. "I did," Clara said. Harold looked at Cole again. Something moved through his expression, something complicated, something she thought might be reassessment. "Harold Whitmore," Cole said, and held out his hand. He didn't add anything to it. No nice to meet you. No warmth, but no hostility either. Just his name and his hand, offered plainly. Harold shook it. "Cole Brennan." "I know who I am," Cole said, and went to see to the horse, and left them to it. Clara stood on the porch with her uncle. Harold said, "You look well." "I am well," she said. "The ranch suits you." She looked at him steadily. She had thought about this conversation for 2 months, had run through versions of it on the long dark evenings of September, while Cole did the accounts and the children slept, and she had arrived at a position she was going to hold. "Come inside," Harold said. "I've got coffee." Well, they sat in the kitchen she'd grown up in. It was dirtier than she'd kept it, dishes in the basin, the stove needing blacking, the window over the sink clouded with grease. Harold had been managing alone, which he had always been bad at. He'd never needed to learn because there had always been someone, her mother, then her, to do it for him. The coffee was weak. She drank it. "Your letter," she said. "You said you knew it was wrong when you did it." Harold wrapped both hands around his cup. He was looking at the table. "Yes." "I want to know why you did it anyway." A pause. "Because it was easy," Harold said. "And I'm a man who takes the easy way. I always have." He said it without apparent shame, which was almost worse than shame would have been. It was the flat statement of a man who has run out of the energy required for self-deception. "You were a burden I hadn't planned for." Brennan offered a solution. "I took it." Clara looked at him. "I was 18 years old." "I know." "I was your brother's daughter." "I know that too." Harold's jaw worked. "I'm not arguing with you. I told you I know it was wrong. I'm not asking you to excuse it." "What are you asking me?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Cole moving around the yard. The particular purposeful sounds of a man who is giving two people room and keeping himself occupied in the meantime. "I don't know," Harold said. "I wrote the letter, and then I didn't know what I wanted from it." He looked up at her. His eyes were older than she remembered, and tired. "Maybe I just wanted you to know I knew." Clara held her cup. The coffee was cold. Here was the thing about Harold Whitmore. He had not done her a cruelty in the way that men who hate do cruelties. He had done her a cruelty in the way that weak people do cruelties, out of convenience, out of the desire to not be inconvenienced, out of the comfortable absence of real moral engagement with the people around him. He hadn't hated her. He'd simply never thought hard enough about what she was worth. That was its own kind of damage. She'd spent a long time understanding that. She also understood, and this was the part that had taken longer, the part that had come to her slowly over the winter months on the ranch, sitting with Margaret's notes, and Cole's particular honesty, and 3 children who had taught her without intending to what it meant to be someone worth showing up for. She also understood that she could not carry Harold Whitmore's failure around in her chest forever. Not because he deserved release from it, but because she did. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," she said. "It wasn't all right. What you did changed my life in ways I couldn't have predicted and couldn't have chosen, and you did it without asking me, and you should have done better." Harold was looking at the table. "But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being the girl you sold," she said. "I have too much to do." Harold looked up. "I have 3 children who call me by my name, and 1 who calls me Mama Clara, and a husband who told me the truth when it cost him something, and a house that's mine, and a piece of land in Wyoming that I've bled for this past year." She held her uncle's eyes. "I'm not going to let what you did sit in the middle of all of that and take up space." Harold's throat worked. "I'm not forgiving you because you've earned it," Clara said. "I'm letting it go because I've earned the right to put it down." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's a better outcome than I deserve," Harold said finally. His voice was rough. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." She picked up her cold coffee and finished it anyway, because she'd never been able to stomach waste, and then she stood up and went to the door and called to Cole that they'd be ready to leave within the hour, and then she went back inside and washed the 2 cups in Harold's clouded sink, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was there and she knew how, and it was the ordinary human thing to do. Harold stood beside her while she washed. "The ranch is good?" he said, not making conversation, asking. "The ranch is good," she said, "and Harold glanced toward the yard. "He's good to you." "Better than I knew to ask for," Clara said. She set the cups to dry, which is usually how the things worth having arrive. Harold said nothing. She dried her hands and got her coat. At the door she stopped. "All right," she said. "When the baby comes." Harold blinked. He looked at her. Really looked, for the first time since she'd arrived. She'd known since late September. She hadn't told Cole yet, had been holding it close for a few weeks, getting used to the shape of the knowledge. She wasn't sure why she'd told Harold first, except that perhaps it was the most complete possible answer to the question of what had become of the girl he'd sold, what she'd built from it, what was coming. "Clara," Harold said, and for once the word carried something that might have been the beginning of an emotion he'd never learned to complete. "Take care of yourself," she said. "See the doctor regularly." She went down the porch steps to where Cole was waiting with the wagon and the horse in the flat October light. She told Cole that evening. They were camped beside the same creek where, on the journey out nearly a year ago, he'd handed her coffee without being asked and told her he wanted to be clear about something. The fire was going and the sky above them was enormous and scattered with cold stars. She told him simply and directly, the way she told him everything that mattered. Cole sat very still for a moment after she finished. The firelight moved across his face. "Since September," he said. "Late September. I wanted to be sure before I said anything." He was quiet for another moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, which was not something he did often. Not publicly, not in the easy, unconscious way of people who'd been together a long time. He did it deliberately, the way he did most things. "You all right?" he said. "I'm well," she said. "The doctor and Laramie can confirm in the spring." I'm not asking about the doctor, he said. She looked at him. In the firelight, his face was serious and open in the way it got when he decided to stop managing the surface of things. I'm better than all right, she said. He held her hand and said nothing, and they sat by the fire in the October dark. And somewhere beyond the ring of firelight, Wyoming waited for them, the ranch, and the children, and the winter coming, and everything that was theirs. The winter was hard but not brutal, which passed for mercy in that country. Clara was sick in the mornings through November and December with a regularity that Molly noticed before anyone said anything, Molly being the kind of person who noticed things and waited to be told rather than asking. And when Clara finally told her in mid-December, Molly's face went through surprise and then a complicated private passage of emotion and then something that settled, gradually, into something warmer than what had been there before. Will it be a girl or a boy? Molly asked. I don't know yet, Clara said. I hope it's a girl, Molly said. Then immediately, or a boy. Either one. Very diplomatic, Clara said. Molly almost smiled. For Molly, almost was most of the way there. Lily simply accepted the news as confirmation of something she'd apparently already concluded. I know about babies, she announced. Martha Heller's mother had one, and it cried for 3 months, and then it got better. Thank you for that, Clara said. You're welcome, Lily said with complete sincerity. Ethan said nothing when Cole told him, but later that evening he came to Clara in the kitchen while she was doing the evening bread and stood near the table in the way he'd stood near it that very first morning, in the dark at 4:30 with cold water in front of him. I just want to say, Ethan said carefully, that whatever it is, I'll look out for it. Clara kept her hands in the dough. I know you will, she said. Because that's what I do, he said. Look out for the ones who can't do it yet themselves. She looked at him. 12 years old and already carrying something that most men didn't find until much later. The understanding that the job of the stronger person is to make room for the weaker one until the weaker one doesn't need it anymore. Your mother would be proud of you, Clara said. It was the first time she'd said it directly to him, without provocation, without it coming up naturally in conversation. She'd been careful with those words for a year, had not deployed them carelessly. Ethan was very still. I know, he said finally. He said it quietly but without uncertainty. I know she would. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. Clara turned back to the bread. Her eyes were wet. She didn't do anything about it, and there was nobody there to see it anyway. The baby came in June. It was a girl, which pleased Lily enormously, and which Clara had suspected since February from the particular way she was carrying, though she didn't mention this until it was confirmed. The birth was difficult, not dangerously so, but hard in the way that first births often are, the way that reminds you that the body knows what it's doing, but that knowing something and doing it are two separate propositions. Doc Harlan was there, Cole was there, which had not been the plan, but which became the reality when it became clear that Clara was not going to let him out of the room, a detail she did not remember later with complete clarity, but which Cole reported with an expression that combined sheepishness with something that was unmistakably proud. The baby was healthy. She was small and loud and had a quantity of dark hair that she apparently had no intention of losing. She opened her eyes almost immediately after she was cleaned and looked at the room with the particular focused intensity of someone who has arrived somewhere and intends to understand it. She looks like she's assessing the situation, Bill said from the doorway, where he had positioned himself at some point during the proceedings without anyone noticing. Get out of the doorway, Bill, Cole said. Yes, sir, Bill said, and didn't move. They named her Rose. Not for anyone, not for a grandmother or a sentiment, just because it was the name that seemed to belong to her, the way the names of some children arrive fully formed before the child has done anything to earn them. Rose Brennan. Lily said it 17 times the first day, testing the sound of it. Molly said it once, carefully, with a nod, as though confirming an arrangement. Ethan said it to the baby directly, crouching down to where Clara held her, looking into the small, earnest face. Hi, Rose, he said. I'm Ethan. I'm your brother. He said it with the plain seriousness of someone making a commitment, and Clara believed him completely. Years would pass, as they do. This is not a story that ends at its ending. It continues the way lives continue, accreting ordinary days and seasonal rhythms, and the particular texture of a specific piece of land lived on by specific people. But some things settled into shape in the years that followed and are worth knowing. The ranch became what Cole had been working toward for a decade: stable, productive, known in the territory as a place run well and honestly. Bill stayed until he was 63 and then retired to a small house in Laramie and received packages of preserved food from Clara every fall for the rest of his life, which he accepted with gruff appreciation and never directly acknowledged, which was very Bill. Ethan grew into exactly the person he'd been building himself toward. He was tall, direct, better with animals than with words, deeply loyal to the people he'd decided were his. He took on more of the ranch as he grew, and by the time he was 17, there were decisions that Cole deferred to him, not out of sentiment, but because Ethan's judgment had earned it. He did not become a soft man or an easy man, but he became a good one, which is the harder thing to become and worth considerably more. Molly finished her mother's quilt and then made another one, and another after that. She had the eye for it, the particular spatial intelligence that quilting requires, the ability to see the whole from the parts before the parts are assembled. She taught Lily, and eventually Rose, with a patience that Clara recognized as being entirely her own rather than inherited or taught. It was simply Molly's nature to take the thing she'd learned and give it away. Lily stayed herself, which is to say, she stayed loud and certain and full of opinions about everything, and she grew into a young woman who could fill a room without trying, and who had Margaret's dark hair and Clara's stubbornness and some third quality that belonged to nobody but her. She was the first of the children to leave the ranch. She went to study in Laramie at 20 and sent letters home that Cole read aloud at the table because they were too entertaining not to share. Rose grew up knowing two things with equal certainty: that she had a mother who had arrived at this ranch as a stranger and built it into a home through will and steadiness and nothing else, and that there had been a woman before her mother who had loved this family so much she'd left notes in canning jars for people she'd never meet. She grew up understanding that families are built, not given, that the bond that holds people together is not the accident of blood, but the daily, undramatic choice to show up and stay. She carried this understanding for the rest of her life. She passed it on. Clara was 31 when she stood in the south pasture on a May morning that was almost exactly 7 years from the first time she'd gone there with Cole. Rose was playing somewhere behind her. She could hear her in the grass, the monologue that 5-year-olds conduct with themselves and the immediate world. Ethan was visible in the far pasture with 2 of the new hands, working the fence line with the economical purpose of someone who has stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. From the house came the faint sound of Molly's voice, which meant Molly was teaching. She'd started teaching Lily's youngest neighbor child to quilt that spring, a 7-year-old with more patience than most adults. Clara stood at Margaret's marker. The wildflowers were up again. They came up every May, reliable and small and yellow in the wet grass. She'd stopped bringing them because they were already here every year. The land brought them without being asked. She put her hand on the top of the stone, the same gesture she'd made the day of her wedding, 7 years ago. What she felt standing there was not grief precisely, and not gratitude precisely. It was something that didn't have a clean name. The particular complex emotion of a person who understands that the life they are living was shaped in part by someone they never met, and that this is not a debt to be paid, but simply a truth to be honored. She thought about the notes. She still had them, all of them, transferred from her coat pocket to a small wooden box Cole had made for her the first Christmas after they married, when she'd finally told him the full count of what she'd found and where. He'd read each one sitting at the kitchen table on a January afternoon, and he'd been very quiet afterward, and she hadn't pushed, and that evening he'd gone out to the south pasture alone and come back in time for supper and not spoken about it, and she hadn't needed him to. She thought about what it means to leave something behind. Not the grand things, not monuments or reputations or the formal recording of a life, but the small practice things. The recipes someone thought to write down. The trick to the pump, told to a boy in a dark kitchen. The way to make a seam that holds. The particular understanding that some people need to feel useful before they can feel anything else. These are the things that last. Not because they were intended to last, but because someone took the trouble to pass them on, and then someone else took the trouble to use them and pass them further. This, Clara thought, was how the dead remained present among the living. Not in the grand permanent way of stone and names, but in the small ordinary ways of practice and habit and the knowledge of how to do things correctly. The knowledge moving forward through time, from hand to hand, carrying with it the invisible trace of all the hands that had held it before. "Mama Clara," Rose said from behind her. Clara turned around. Rose was standing in the grass a few feet away, holding something in both hands with the solemn concentration of a child who has found something important. It was a rock, smooth, river-rounded, pale gray, the kind you find in creek beds. "Can I put it here?" Rose said. She meant the marker. Clara looked at her daughter, this girl with her father's dark eyes and her own stubborn set to the jaw, and thought about all the things this child knew without knowing she knew them. All the shapes pressed into her simply by being raised in this house among these people on this particular piece of land. "Yes," Clara said. She'd like that. Rose placed the rock carefully at the base of the marker with the precision of a child doing something that matters. She stepped back and looked at it. "Good," she said, satisfied. Clara took her daughter's hand and they walked back to the house together through the May morning, through the wild flowers coming up in the wet grass, through the land that had once been the most frightening thing Clara could imagine and had become, by some ordinary, impossible alchemy of time and work and stubbornness and love, the most familiar. No. Some years later, enough years that Rose was grown and the ranch had changed in the ways that working land changes, always becoming more fully what it was always trying to be. People in that part of Wyoming would mention the Brennan Ranch in the particular way that places with a distinct character get mentioned. Not famous, not storied in the grand sense, just known. Known to be a place where people did things right and stuck around and took care of what they'd been given. The woman who had come there first as a transaction and had become its heart was not remembered as a heroine or a saint or as any kind of simplified version of herself. She was remembered as someone who showed up and stayed, which is the most accurate and least glamorous description of what real strength looks like when you see it close. She'd been frightened in the beginning. She'd been angry. She'd been proud in ways that sometimes made things harder, stubborn in ways that sometimes made things possible, patient out of strategy before she became patient out of actual peace, which took longer than she would have liked to admit. She had not been purchased, in the end, not in any sense that mattered. She had been offered a place by accident and had built it into a home by intention, and the building had changed her the way that real work always changes you, not into someone better in the abstract, but into someone more specifically herself. That was the story. Not a clean story, not a simple one, a true one, in the way that the best stories are true, which is not in the facts exactly, but in the feeling underneath the facts, the part that makes you recognize something you already knew. The frontier kept going. The land stayed. The people who loved it well left their trace in it, the way water leaves its trace in stone, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once permanently. And every May, without fail, the wildflowers came up in the south pasture of the Brennan Ranch, yellow and small and certain, asking nothing of anyone, simply arriving as they always had and always would, proof that what survives the winter is not always what you expected to survive, but that it survives, and that surviving and returning and persisting in the faithful annual fact of itself is its own kind